people who aren't here and who can't join can listen retrospectively. I've got some colleagues here at University of Canberra that are very sorry they can't be here through other meetings. They'd love to listen to this at a later date. So I'm going to hand over to Justin, who is going to begin this session and talk to us and set up the agenda for the discussion that will follow. And you can see all the names there on the screen, quite a collective of authors. So thank you so much and looking forward to it, Justin.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very happy to be here with all of you. I would like to begin by acknowledging all the other First Nations people on whose lands we gather today. I'd like to thank Pryor and Anne for the opportunity to share this important work through this CERN Asia forum. It's also a very big privilege and honor to work with my co-authors, Jin, Suli, Huong, Pryor, Kelly, and Katharine. It's wonderful to draw upon your expertise and to try to weave together these different research topics and contexts into this paper. Much of the impetus behind this paper is really this recognition that climate change is happening and the acknowledgement that global warming is likely to exceed the 2 degrees Celsius target. It's becoming clear that we need to we need to adapt in different ways. So more of the same old will not be enough. Next slide, please. So in 2021, the authors of this paper convened one panel in the Ljubljana conference, which ran for 2 weeks and provided an opportunity for the Community Economies Network to share their research with one another. And so the title of our panel is Post-Development Approaches Towards Just and Sustainable Climate Change Adaptation. Drawing upon the lens of post-development and diverse economies, we asked, are we really adapting well to climate change? And what lessons do our indigenous local communities from the majority world offer for the practice of climate change adaptation? And so this paper, this presentation is our collective attempt to try to address this important question and to reimagine diverse ways of adapting to climate change. Next slide, please. Now we observe that there appears to be a neo-colonial takeover of climate change adaptation in the majority world. You know that climate change adaptation also follows the same colonialist logic of development. And this is made evident in the following ways. First, climate change is increasingly represented as particularly dangerous, mainly for those in the majority world. There is a clear manufactured border between parts of the world that are supposed to be safe, the minority world, and those that are regularly affected by extreme weather events and therefore are very vulnerable, the majority world. Second, the majority world as needing to be quote-unquote saved by the knowledge, tools, and expertise of the minority world. This is what we're seeing in mainstream approaches to adaptation, that they rely on this parallel ontology of vulnerability, which presents that there's this need for external assistance and approaches to those in climate peril. Third, there is the dominance of Western-centric understandings and approaches to adaptation makes invisible the diverse and place-based strategies in the majority world. And this is definitely our contribution to knowledge. We're going to provide empirical examples of how these place-based knowledges are being eroded by mainstream approaches to adaptation. So we are situating our work within this literature called Decolonising Climate and Adaptation Scholarship, DCAS. We are contributing to decolonizing practices by foregrounding this non-Western worldviews and knowledges and emphasizing people's agency and adaptation. So we recognize and we affirm people's capacities to adapt, to respond to climate change in their own priorities for self-determination. Next slide, please. So to do this, we are drawing upon Bonaventure de Sousa Santos' approach called epistemologies of the South for inspiration. So we argue that the ES approach has parallelisms with the fundamental components of DCAS and is therefore relevant for climate adaptation scholarship. De Sousa Santos calls for 2 key actions. First, sociology of absence, an investigation that aims to demonstrate that what does not exist is actively produced as non-existent. That is as a non-credible alternative to what exists. So there are 5 types of monocultures that De Sousa Santos has identified. The monoculture of knowledge, which refers to modern science as the only sole criteria of truth. Monoculture of linear time, which describes practices as backwards or underdeveloped. Monoculture of classification, which is the labeling of populations according to categories that naturalizes hierarchies. the monoculture of the universal and the global, which renders the local as non-credible. And lastly, the monoculture of capitalist productivity, which privileges economic growth. The other call for action from the Sousa Santos is a sociology of emergence. This involves the identification of the knowledges and practices that have emerged to overcome the sociology of the absences, the monocultures produced by hegemonic knowledge systems. So it requires seeing and valuing the diversity and multiplicity of knowledge and practices employed by local communities, especially in the majority world, who themselves have long coped with extreme weather events. Next slide, please. So our authorial collective is led by researchers from Fiji, from Vietnam, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, with the long-term commitments and access to knowledge from both our formal research activities and long-term relationships. We are following the example of Gibson Graham in 2005. No, we engage in two moments: sociology of absences, to identify the instances where groups have worked to silence, to suppress, and to render invisible the locally based adaptation, and a sociology of emergences, to articulate these diverse knowledges and practices that residents are already engaged in climate change. So that's an overall background of what the research presentation is all about, what the research is all about. I now turn to our case studies. I will now give the floor first to Suli. This will be followed by Huong, Jin, and then Pryor. Suli, floor is yours.
Thank you, Justin. Kia ora koutou katoa. Also would like to acknowledge the people of Naitahu, the custodian of this land, where Canterbury University, and I'm talking from Canterbury University. So this case study is in Fiji, the other island. There are two main islands, Vitilevu and Vunibola. The village, a very small village, very rural. The only source of transportation is through the waterways, the river. And if you look at my background, that's the very river I'm talking about. And that village is down this way, my right hand. So next slide, please. I got 6 slides to talk to in 5 minutes. The monoculture of knowledge, an example. So I don't want to read what is there, but I'll just tell the story. So looking at education, I was a teacher in Fiji for 12 years and been looking at these even now, reflecting of how the education system, how the curriculum has been borrowed externally from other developed or so-called country and taken to the Pacific to be implemented, because I think that's how development was seen, that they need those knowledge. So the monoculture of knowledge, looking at, for Fiji, the modern education system is such that it's so purely academic. What I can say is that from any village, this is a particular school, they start to live in the dormitory, in the hostel, from 6 years old, and I'm a product of that, until 21 years old when you go to university. So you leave your home so early and you're embedded into this modern education kind of system. But statistics, it's so true that about 90% of these students who go through the school system end back in their village, and they are so loosely attached. They're so detached from reality when we talk about climate change or climate crisis adaptation. When we talk about for these locations, they are far away from rural urban areas. Like the first help after any tropical cyclone will be weeks or months away. What do they live on? The environment, their connections with the environment. But education, academic education, doesn't really equip them to do that. I can discuss that more in the near future. So activities like fishing, prawning, understanding traditional indigenous knowledge is really not reflected a lot in the education curriculum. Next slide, please. So the other one is a monoculture of capitalistic productivity. So this particular village used to have a lot of resources in terms of the land and the waterways. So the understanding of trying to become modern, the idea of modernity, the idea of modern amenities. Yes, we can say we are lucky to have internet, we have power, but when you talk about these rural locations, when you ask them now, what do you want? They want these modern amenities, and in order to do that, they need to exploit their resources somehow. So this is what happened. heavily engaged in logging, mass removal of native trees, and of course, when they developed the village, where they did the village in the picture, they have to remove all the topsoil, which has been supporting biodiversity and supporting food security, like getting their food right from near the village. And the devastation is huge in terms of flooding, with the removal of mangroves from the force, from the river bank, because that's just 10 minutes away from the sea. And you know, the difficulty of growing your own food right near the house because of infertility in terms of soil. Next slide. So when I did my PhD, the next slide, these are some of the activities that we tried to do, because what the women have been saying, that when the dead or the youth or the male counterparts of the community are in the forest, looking after plantation, so they have farm camps, the women and the children need to access food, but they are unable to grow it. So we engage, including the getting knowledge from the elders, and these are some of the practices that they involve in order to revive the soil health and to grow their crops. Next slide. So that's the idea of having food right near the vicinity of the home. Those from devastated landscape, growing the food systems around the house, as well as which really supporting the role of indigenous knowledge in terms of the kind of global north, giving to the global south the idea of how to adapt, whereby now we're trying to use indigenous knowledge systems which are already there to use in adaptation strategies. Thank you.
Perfect timing. So is it Huong who's next?
Yes.
I'll keep time for you, Huong. So you've got 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, yes. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So yes, my name is Huong Do, and this is come from my PhD project. And so I would like to acknowledge my supervisor, Kelly Dombroski, and also pupil from Vietnam, and also the NZS scholarship. So just quite quick introduction. Yes, so the case study in Vietnam we choose that is the Cuaton communities in the Thái Bình province. So you can see on the map here is the coastal communities, and also is also next to the big rivers in Thái Bình. So it's also the kind of like the lowest low land areas in the Thái Bình province, and the most important and also the main disaster related to the climate change is the flood, salinities, and also the water scarcities in the dry season. Yes, next slide, please. So we figure out some kind of like example of the action here. So the first one is the monoculture of the knowledge. It's related to the how government promote for the kind of like advanced technologies and kind of scientific toolkit and protocol for managing and also measuring the water qualities and also the salt concentration to manage and to control the irrigation system. For example, you can see on the slide is the picture of the sluice gate. So the government promote the local officials use the advanced technology to measure water before lifting the gate to get fresh water for the paddy field. But the local there, and especially the local officials who is responsible for the managing and control this gate, he preferred to use his embodied knowledge. It's very local knowledge to control this gate, so that that kind of like one example of the absence. And the other one is related to the linear time. So the evidence here is related to the farming practice In Vietnam at the moment, it still follow kind of like to get more yield, to get more growth per year. So the government want to push. Normally in the past we have two rice crop per year, but now they push for kind of like two rice crop and crops, and also one more crops for kind of like some to cultivate some veggies. So in order to do that, so they need to kind of like to shorten the interval times between two rice crop, and with the support of the, for example, chemical fertilizers or some chemicals, agrochemicals, it can be good and can be okay, but under the climate change, when the weather is changed unpredictably, with the very short interval time between the two rice crop, it sometimes affect to the to the farmers, and it's also try to kind of like how can I say, underestimate the traditional practice where the farmers, local farmers, want to keep the interval times between the two rice crop in the particular amount of time. For example, in the past, so they want to, they often do it at least 4 weeks, but now under the government policies and kind of like cultivation scheme, they only give the farmers only 2 weeks. So it's also another kind of example of the actions of the kind of like really acknowledge and really follow the what is the traditional one. Next slide, please. So based on kind of like we do some research, and we figure out that what is the adaptation strategies that's local applied there, and not kind of like let the actions happen. So we point out the 3 main adaptation strategy that based on the local knowledge, and also the very local initiative. So the first one is, and the main, or the main approach that's local apply here, is to engaging attentively and bodily to the non-human world to adapt to the climate change impact. So it's like the collaborative adaptation is not only based on the government support, not only based on the farmer as the human, but it's also need to work together with the non-human entities. So I point out here the 3 main adaptation strategy is already applied in Thai Binh and in the Cuaton province, Cuaton community. So the first one is like listening and communicating with the rivers.
So you're at your 5 minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to just say one last big point?
Yes. So other one is like plantings on the riverbank, and the last one is apply the embodied knowledge to manage all the farming activities. Yeah.
So maybe if we have a bit of time in the discussion, we can come back to some of the points that you might not have got to make yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So Jin, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Anne. My name is Jin. Good morning, everyone. I'm reporting and presenting from Hong Kong. So our case study, the first case study in the Philippines, is called Mamanwa. They are a community of indigenous peoples located in Basay. So they are considered as indigenous peoples by our government under the IPRA law. But in this case, they are considered as migrant indigenous peoples who are living in Basay because they originally came from Mindanao, the southern island in the Philippines, but they had to migrate in Visayas, where Basay is located, after World War II because of military harassment as well as intermittent fightings in their ancestral lands. So currently, what you are seeing in the picture is actually their temporary residence relocation site post-Haiyan, after Typhoon Haiyan, which devastated the Philippines in 2013 and is considered one of the deadliest and costliest typhoons in recent history. So what I'm going to share with you is our findings based on their experiences before, during, and after Typhoon Haiyan. Next slide, please. So there are two types of sociology of absences that we found in Basay, particularly in the case of the Mamanwas. First is the monoculture of knowledge, where the local non-Indigenous peoples, the residents, the Basaynons, prefer technical weather news reports, and they considered it more credible compared to the traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge by the Mamanwas. This experience happened before Haiyan, because 2 weeks before Haiyan, they were already preparing for a calamity. During that time, Mamanwas don't know what the hazard was, but they know based on the signs that they experienced and that they saw from their elders, from their local weather forecast, using the directions of the winds. They already know that there is a calamity that will happen, but they don't know that it's a typhoon yet. So they tried warning the local residents about this impending hazard, but they were just laughed at. They were considered just as a joke, because these non-IP residents do not consider their knowledge as credible and as important compared to local news reports. Second is the monoculture of linear time, which is evident based on the experiences of local DRR champions who consider local indigenous knowledge as equally important in terms of integrating to local DRR projects and programs. So during the interagency working group meeting for DRR, this is between different DRR representatives of government agencies in Eastern Visayas region. These local champions tried lobbying for the integration of local indigenous knowledge in the different DRR programs, but they are overpowered by so-called experts, researchers, and scientists from the Department of Science and Technology, research groups, and other think tanks. So it has been a constant failure to integrate local indigenous knowledge systems in terms of the policy environment, as well as the policy dialogues. So next slide, please. But there are local initiatives to counter this narrative of scientific knowledge being superior to local knowledge. One of this is the deliberate sharing of traditional ecological knowledge at the community level. So what happened is that after their experience with Typhoon Haiyan, the elders made it a point to convene the different community members, both old and the young, to share their different traditional ecological knowledge. For examples, the way they use their different traditional evacuation strategies. They read the movements of the wind, the sounds made by insects, pigs, as well as other animals, as well as the importance of their religious beliefs in treating or interpreting hazards such as typhoons, floodings, and other things. Because this is very important. Mamanwas are farmers, subsistence farmers, that highly rely on their own produce from their borrowed lands. So they use, for example, their just like in Fiji, they have this weather calendar that they use in terms of timing their planting and different activities in planting. And this is very significant, because if the timing is not correct, they may go hungry in the future or in their daily activities. The next one is the integration at the government level. Next slide, please.
So you're at time, Jin. So can this be your last slide?
Yeah. Just the integration of traditional ecological knowledge in some of the programs of the Department of Social Welfare and Development, particularly in the community and family development modules for different IPs in the region. I can discuss more of it later.
Thank you so much. And so now we're moving to you, Pryor.
Thank you, Anne. My name is Pryor Placino. I'm presenting this case from Bangkok, Thailand. So this last case we are presenting today puts into question the prevalence of steel reinforced concrete as a building material for post-disaster shelter in the Philippines. So in particular, we present the socially innovative interventions undertaken by a local NGO called Base Bahay. Base enrolls locally abundant bamboo species in constructing low-cost and climate-resilient housing in frequently typhoon-hit provinces such as Iloilo, Leyte, Sorsogon, Samar, and the photo here shows Base Bahay Village in Pasay, Samar, also Negros Occidental and Metro Manila. So Base partners with local government units and other NGOs whose advocacy center on housing, such as Habitat for Humanity, to deliver their bamboo incorporated housing. So one type of absence that we problematize through this case is the monoculture of knowledge, and this is manifested in the popular appeal of reinforced concrete in mainstream housing, as in post-disaster housing like the one shown in this slide. So there is privileging in the use of these materials because of its spectacular material properties such as strength and durability. But these characteristics will not remain in perpetuity since the iron in the steel reinforcement can corrode. And as the popular saying goes by builders, if it ain't cracked, it ain't concrete. So without appropriate repair and maintenance, rusting steel reinforcement significantly reduce concrete structures' lifespans. And the widespread concretization of buildings and structures, however, generates a host of environmental concerns and social inequality issues, which I'll not elaborate here in the interest of time. And another type of absence we saw is the monoculture of linear time. So the heavy dependence on concrete in the Philippines, as in other global South countries, has led to the displacement of indigenous plant-based building materials. So the political economic context, beginning from the colonial period up to post-war nation building and global economic integration, has vigorously promoted the use of mineral-based building inputs like concrete. So for example, the Spanish colonizers had relegated bamboo as fire hazard and introduced masonry stones as strong and earthquake-proof foundation for their stone house architecture. The American colonizer used concrete as a technology of benevolent assimilationist colonial governance. So concrete construction was a form of public good that arguably benefited a majority of the population, but it's changing now given the capture of the elite of the concrete industry and the housing, mainstream housing industry. So concrete buildings have since then become a symbol of national modernization and of good life in terms of economic and status improvement for ordinary Filipinos. So plant-based materials, then like bamboo, continue to be relegated as a poor man's timber, according to Jimenez and Natividad. But this lowly impression of bamboo is being countered by social innovations introduced by Base Bahay. So first, they redefined opportunities from bamboo's material properties that engineers and architects now see as comparable to wood and steel. So for example, Base Bahay has engineered their bamboo frames to provide flexibility and strength against typhoon winds of about 200 to 220 kilometers per hour and 6.4 magnitude earthquakes. So these houses are designed to withstand strong typhoon winds and strong earthquakes. Base Bahay has also been active in pushing the building governance in the Philippines to become responsive in accrediting them as an alternative to mainstream house building system and in promoting the viability and adoption of these new technologies for future low-cost housing projects. So as of 2016, Base Bahay has built 226 units for at least 147 families across the Philippines. And lastly, Base Bahay helps combat a monoculture of linear time by making an indigenous material like bamboo more relevant to the needs of contemporary and regular Filipino households. So they help multiply opportunities around local bamboo economies from ensuring bamboo growing to become sustainable for local farmers, to directly connecting farmers with local enterprises that treat bamboo from infestation and molding, and to training local builders effectively in using bamboo to build local housings. So they also help emphasize the capacity of bamboo forests for carbon sequestration and soil erosion prevention in local contexts. Thank you. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Pryor. And so this is the last slide. And it's such a challenge to try to weave together these different insights because of the diversity of case studies. But I'd like to thank Kelly for the inspiration to try to weave it together. So here it is. We observe a theme running through our 4 case studies, which is based on concrete. Concrete not only as an infrastructure, but concrete as a metaphor for this rigidity, fixicity of mainstream approaches to adaptation that depend on the knowledge systems of the minority world alone. We not only see this proliferation that on concrete-based infrastructure, such as those that you see in modern houses in Fiji or in the post-disaster houses in the Philippines, but we also see a preference given to concrete ways of knowing, such as the promotion of scientific toolkits in Thibin, or for making these weather predictions for the non-indigenous neighbors of the Manwas in Samar. So these adaptation strategies that mainly rely on monocultures of knowledge in the minority world tend to favor such concrete infrastructures and concrete force of knowing. But here's the problem. This preoccupation with concrete leads to the suppression of the traditional indigenous forms of knowledge and adaptation strategies, which in turn, as you have seen in our case studies, led to increased vulnerabilities and marginalization of our communities. For example, the building of modern houses in Fiji now we have resulted to more flooding and the eventual destruction of cultural totem plants that have high cultural significance. In Thibin, the authorities' efforts to promote these aggressive farming techniques eventually led to the increase in plant disease and a decrease in farmers' yield. In Basay, the Manwas are looked down upon and are being disrespected for their traditional beliefs, resulting to their disenfranchisement and the perception of being left out of the wider community. Now, here's the thing. Our findings challenge the popular notion, popular discourses that dismiss these indigenous forms of adaptation as backward and as ineffective. We actually see that people's traditional indigenous knowledge are actually assets that assist them in adapting to climate change. For example, the traditional weather monitoring system of the Manwas helped them prepare for Typhoon Haiyan. The indigenous agricultural knowledge and techniques among the residents of Naui did not only heal their land from this adverse effects logging, but also help them cultivate new climate resilient crops. Base Bahay is revolutionizing housing construction in the Philippines by promoting the benefits of using bamboo as a post-disaster housing material. So to end, we would like to reiterate that there is more to climate change adaptation apart from its technocratic, top-down, concrete-oriented framings. Effective adaptation techniques can also emanate from the unexpected and peculiar, such as the being attentive and responsive to other species, just like what Huong mentioned in Vietnam, or through a children's game of throwing mangrove seeds into the river, as what mentioned by Suli, or by living simply, as inculcated by the Mamanwas in Samar. So these are all legitimate adaptation practices that can help us move away from concreteness to listening, adapting with awareness and openness to other forms of knowing and being. Thank you so much for your time, and very happy to start the conversation with you.
Thank you so much. What a rich set of ideas, and thank you to all of you for sharing with us. I asked Justin and co-authors to come up with a couple of two guiding questions for us, but it occurs to me that before we get to those questions, someone who's been listening might just want to ask any sort of clarification questions or any sort of, pulling out any more of the ideas that we just heard, and then maybe we can use these as a bit more of a deeper discussion. So I just wanted to open it up for any general questions that people might have, clarification, or just something that you're curious about that people spoke on. Does anyone have any of those kinds of questions? I have one, so maybe I'll kick things off. And Jenny, I'll go to you. I just didn't see you on the screen there. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'm, time delay as my brain tries to figure out how to unmute and make myself visible and everything. Hey, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think, as Anne said, when you put all those examples together, there's just such a richness to each of the stories, but then by putting them together, the richness is really amplified. So I think it's fantastic work and it's really exciting. So I suppose, and I think my question is related to the first question that you've got there on the guide, about the actions that are needed to support and promote. But I suppose I was interested in whether there were any themes across all the case studies about who, like that, the theme of listening, but who are the other people who are listening? So, Pryor talked about NGO. I think, Jin, you talked about some of the Indigenous knowledge that was being amplified. But I just wondered whether there were, where are the possibilities for who we might be in conversation with to make the story bigger. So that, but maybe that's along with the actions.
Is that also a question, just to clarify, of who the audience is for the paper?
Well, or thinking about, because everybody's done research in very particular places. So who in those places are the people who are open to having the conversation?
Okay.
And are there people across, across the different contexts that to help enlarge the conversation?
Great.
Yep.
So perhaps anyone from your group of authors can put their hand up. Who wants
Maybe
to have
I
a go
can
at
answer
answering
first.
that? Sure.
from our case study. So the main audiences for, at least at the community level, for the knowledge sharing on traditional Indigenous knowledge are mostly situated in Basay, and only within the community. So I think it's limited. And there's also, because there is one problem in terms of sharing these local Indigenous knowledge, and this is more on the policy side, because the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the Philippines is quite strict in terms of sharing these different knowledge forms related to Indigenous people. So even, for example, one of the interviews from the Department of Social Welfare and Development, he said that it's quite tricky and difficult to even document these types of knowledge because they have to undergo a lot of bureaucratic processes, permissions, this and that. So it demotivates them to engage further. There is no National Commission for Indigenous Peoples Office within Eastern Visayas, within the region. So in order for different, for example, research institutes, different groups, agencies, to get like a proper conversation with the Mamanwas or other Indigenous groups in Eastern Visayas, they have to like get people from other regions to facilitate this process. And it takes a lot of time, it takes money. So this is like one reason for delay, as well as this interest of pursuing this kind of conversation. But there are different ways, innovations made at the local, wherein, for example, they communicate directly, the different agencies communicate directly with the community, for example, the Mamanwas. And once they get, for example, their approval, they invite them to share it during seminars. I think some local universities have like partnerships in terms of extension services. So that's one way. But so far, what I can see is that it's really limited. It's only within them. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I can add. I think conversation has been already extended to the government by the base Baha'i, given that they've already started having sort of like technical discussing or creating a standard for the use of this kind of alternative material like bamboo. So that would also cascade to whether construction companies will actually, adapt or use this kind of technologies and explore further the value of this material. But I'm also very interested in that, that this conversation would be picked up by architects, construction companies, not just in the global south, but also in the global north. I got this idea from architect Mitul Bahanbati during our conversation a few weeks ago, that, it's also good to kind of, get the attention of the global north so that they can begin to showcase the use of these new kinds of technologies in their own landscape, to sort of like set an influencer example, even if it's contradictory, that it would become a new kind of neo-colonial construction, but that would really change the face of how the construction industry would go on a different path in the future.
Justin?
Anyone else from the group would like to add before I share what I think?
Yes, so maybe can I ask that just small point? So based on my research and also the kind of like the work with the government, so it's very personal experience, but my one is go through the communications and also kind of like training. So at the moment now, also Vietnam with COP26, so it's related to the EBA adaptation intervention in Vietnam. So it's get more kind of like attractions from the government. I'm also kind of like gone through with the communication and training program and kind of sharing that experience from the local. And we also even work with the kind of like the committees of Buddhists in Vietnam, and it's alive with the Buddhist principle. So it's have a different way of sharing our research, our kind of like, how can I say, approach to the local base and EBAs, let's say, adaptation strategy. So maybe it's not really up to the national or provincial adaptation policies, but at least it's give like more awareness, and also they give some more room for the local government and also local people to do the adaptation work. Yeah, so thank you.
Julie.
Well, for the case of Fiji, I think it's more with the framing, how people frame, how people think. Their worldview really changed a lot. What I'm saying is that even at we've tried from the government kind of level, at the moment, anything to be indigenous in Fiji can be seen as racist. It can be a political statement. And when you go to the level of, at the village level, the rural communities, when you start talking to them and senses around production of agricultural, using indigenous knowledge systems, they said that it takes a lot of job to do that, and to be organically certified and tap onto the organic market to revitalize rural economies. That's another complexity. And there's a particular group or an institution that look at that. And for the people to, I think there should be an unschooling kind of process. We really need to unpack a lot of things on how people think. I can talk about this when I go to these rural locations, but for them, it's so difficult for them to go back. I think because I work a lot with horticulture at the Maori horticulture here in New Zealand, it's easier for them because they went through the whole cycle of, they almost lost their culture, their language, their way of being, their way of understanding things. And I think for situations like Fiji, it's how people frame and think need to be revolutionized, and then from there go on. Because right now, there are just few NGOs who are trying to propagate, to walk around the idea of decolonizing adaptations. And I'm fortunate that I'm in a project here at the University of Canterbury, looking at Pacific Ocean and climate crisis assessment. And we're looking at from an indigenous knowledge systems kind of view of adaptation, rather than a very neoliberal top-down adaptation. For example, everybody want to drive electronic vehicle, all solar systems in the villages in Fiji, but after running for 1 year, who's going to repair them? The rust, the frame become rusted for coastal areas where my mom come from. Who's going to do that? And for electric vehicles, where do we get the rare metals? And even they're looking at seabed mining in Fiji. And when we talk about the dollar signs to those landowners and custodian of the land, some of them are raising their hand, yes, we want to do it. But framing, we have to really take the people back and unschooling and to decolonize the way people think. Because when government or institution go to these people, they also have to make decisions from that angle. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Uli. 1 minute just to try to synthesize everything. For me, the conversations have to happen in multiple scales, at the macro, at the meso, and at the micro scale. At the macro scale, engaging with this big global climate change bodies like IPCC, United Nations, and try to lobby for the inclusion of indigenous people's representatives in these bodies. Try to enshrine, to enshrine international law, the rights, to uphold the rights of these groups. At the mesoscale, governments, NGOs, private companies, to advocate, not, to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. If they don't want to build infrastructures in their communities, we shouldn't force them to. And lastly, at the local scale, I think it's, for us in the academe, in our own communities, to change the discourse, to perpetuate, to spread that innovations are happening in the in our communities, to start the process of unlearning, as what Suli said, engaging in yarning, just engaging with community members more to understand how they perceive how the climate change, how they perceive their own ways of adapting. And lastly, being open to collaboration, to collaborating with different stakeholders, to try to find solutions to this wicked problem that we have.
If I can jump in and then go to you, Tessa, it's very interesting to hear your comments, Suli, about frames and framework, and it made me think about your metaphor of concrete. And I started thinking about your, the sense that when you're talking about your concrete, the way you use that, Pryor, and then I think Kelly, there was a bit of dialogue about concrete, Justin, that you used as a bit of a way of thinking through your material. But it's almost like concrete becomes that metaphor for the materiality or the matter. But what Suli was talking about was the frameworks, the scaffolds, and so being able to unpack or unschool the knowledge systems. And I think it's interesting to think about how you set up the framework, the frame for your building, then what material you use for what's being built, what kind of livelihoods are being built, what kind of practices are involved in the building as well. So, from a community economies perspective, you're thinking about the frameworks, the structures, the scaffolds that you set up for knowledge and what kind of knowledge you want to frame, then what kind of materials you're actually going to build with, and how sensitive you are to the earth and the sustainability of the practices, and then who is involved in those practices, what practices are being fostered, what building practices are you advocating for. So it's kind of interesting thinking about that. So Suli, I don't know whether that's helpful, but I think your point about frameworks is really key, isn't it? Because it's what kind of knowledge, practices and framing you want to actually support to enable that to continue to be fostered. Tessa.
Hi everyone. I'm going to ask just a quick question. Oh, that's my dog, sorry. And change topic a little bit, but I work as a molecular biologist and we're working on a report for the IPCC on genetically modified plants and how they can help with climate change. So of course the argument is that you can make more drought resistant plants and things like that, but our thoughts are that indigenous based farming is the most sustainable practice overall. So, you know, so small subsistence farming. Yeah, is better. So I just wanted to ask if any of you had any experience with GMOs and communities becoming reliant on them, and if they've been detrimental, just to get a diverse range of opinions.
I actually supervised another thesis, which actually his work would have fitted in well here too. A few of you know Dorji, who was working in the Himalaya and in the Tibetan Plateau, and his community was given a new wheat crop by the government and by some companies to grow that was much more productive than their previous wheat crop, and then they practiced their usual seed saving techniques that they've been using for centuries, and the next year it was not so productive, and then the year after it was a fail, and they weren't told that it was genetically modified, but he's guessing that that was what happened to kind of lock them into that corporate structure of having to continually buy seed every year, which wasn't within their cultural tradition. So that's just one example from a similar experience.
And Anissa has put, thank you, Anissa, something to read in the chat space. Don't know whether you want to comment on that, Anissa, with your microphone, if you're able.
Sure. Thanks, Anne. Hi, everybody. And sorry, I joined a bit late. Nice to see you all. I didn't want to interrupt the flow of conversation, but I feel like this example might be relevant for the second question that you'd posed, which I have to look at again. I think Pryor put it in the chat. What kinds of initiatives exist in your study areas that facilitate co-production of Indigenous and scientific knowledge? So this is an example at the United Nations level that is really unique. But I don't know if anybody's heard of the Committee on World Food Security, other than people who've heard me talk about it a bunch of times. That's my area of study. Has anybody else heard about it before, any of the speakers? See, it's a really interesting one because it's not very well known, but it's really, really innovative. It's hosted by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and anyone who's familiar with the way that international, like United Nations works, you know, you've got the member states, the governments, and then everybody else is observers. But in this particular committee, Indigenous peoples, organizations, social movements, peasant movements like La Via Campesina are able to participate directly in negotiations around food and agriculture policy with governments in the committee. So there's a participant category. So I've been, you know, accompanying that civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism, and the panel of experts is the body that every time there's a topic agreed on, like youth engagement in agriculture, they ask this panel of experts to come up with like a big report that frames the issues. Now, we're all really familiar with the whole old practice of like top-down expert knowledge, right? Telling local communities what they should know and what they should do. But this one's a little bit different. So it actually does recognize the expertise of Indigenous peoples, of local communities, of grassroots actors. And it's fantastic because we get a lot of really radical things into these reports, like food sovereignty and agroecology. The challenge is getting governments to listen to it, because when they're negotiating these policy instruments, they, in a way, end up having to defend big agribusiness interests because they're caught in these trade regimes and these international debt regimes that really prevent them from promoting the more radical reforms that we know that we need. So it's a really beautiful and innovative space. It's not very well known. It's faced with lots of challenges, but people are really working hard to shift the framing of what food systems transformation and also climate adaptation might mean in that context. Yeah, just wanted to share that example with you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We are almost at a time, so if anyone needs to head off, we maybe just go for another 5 minutes or so. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share? I have a question, but I didn't want to jump in with my question if others wanted to ask one. Now you're all curious about what my question is, aren't you? It's a great one. It's about the time element. So I am very interested in that, I guess, because of work I've done with Katharine Gibson and Lisa Law and others on economic resilience in Asia, where we really looked at that. How do you think backwards and forwards and across tradition and modernity, and what of the future? So I was really interested in how you were trying to put the monoculture of knowledge and the monoculture of linear time alongside each other. So I'll be quite excited to see how you do that in your paper, and then think about emergences as well. But just taking the monoculture of linear time, I remember examples from Botanis. I think, Kelly, you were there back in the New Zealand Geography Conference when we had a session, and I was talking about back to the future and playing with time, how people traverse their past and their traditions in the present day, and then what does it look like as you think forward? You know, for some people who are very traditional, they don't want to move forward. They want to go back to what it was. So I'm curious about that in the context of climate change adaptation. How do you trouble time? Because there's a sense in which we don't want linear time where it's all progressive in one track, but disasters and climate change events and climate uncertainty disrupts time anyway. So you have this whole temporal shift of sudden events versus slow pace of living. How do you deal with disruption? You know, it's almost like you need to, as Katharine and I just wrote recently, learn to live with flux, right? So how do you see yourself troubling time or working against this monoculture of time in your paper? That's my question, but it might be one to think about. If you have any immediate thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
In the context of my case study, I think it would take a lot of time, like train a new generation of architects that would really advocate for these kinds of alternatives. And I'd just like to add to your case on the use of stones in Batanes. Actually, because of infrastructure work, and Batanes doesn't have that much of, I think they don't have a quarry. So the old houses are the ones being crushed to become aggregates for road construction, concrete construction in Batanes. Anyway.
Sadly.
So I think in my case for the Mamanuwas in Basay, that would be an interesting thing to discover when I visit them, hopefully in the coming months, since I'll be doing my field work. And it's been more than 2 years since my last visit to them when I conducted this study. So it's interesting to know whether the knowledge sharing was successful in terms of the learning that the new generations of Mamanuwas get from the elder ones, and maybe to see how they incorporate the other knowledge forms that they get. For example, because the young Mamanuwas are quite adept now with new technologies. So it's interesting to see how they try to merge these two and use it for climate adaptation activities in their area. So that's something that I'm going to take note in the coming months.
I think when I was talking in the New Zealand conference about the Botanis case, I was thinking of people becoming time travelers. So that ability to think to the future while also holding the value of the past. So that's that sort of ability to traverse temporal rhythms and to hold them in tension together at the same time. So, you know, it might be something that in your paper you think about what's the value of thinking about time and how can you use that in the context of climate change adaptation.
I think one of the ways that we're probably approaching it is more the post-development sense of not arranging places along a linear timescale. So these places are backward and these places are advanced, but actually holding all those multiple knowledges and modernities and together rather than putting them in a line. That's the sense I got from, I mean, I've just been doing editing work and Justin's really driven this paper, but I don't know if you would agree, Justin, that was more where we were going with the linear and non-linear time.
Great. So a different arrangement.
Yeah, I agree, Kelly. And yeah, but that's a great point, Anne. So that's something to think about too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I'm sure if anyone else has any comments that they haven't had a chance to raise, they could email you, Justin, as the keeper of knowledge for this group. Or the coordinator of knowledge, shall I say.
And thanks, Justin. You spoke so well, pulling all that together. Very impressive. And everyone did, but you're the one having to hold that.
And hopefully the recording will be useful for you to listen back to as you sort of pull your paper together. So we look forward to seeing how it goes and to reading it. So thanks everyone for joining, and Pryor and I will be in touch. Watch this space for a forthcoming CERN Asia event.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Anne.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Great to
Thank
see
you,
you,
Anne.
Huong. Thanks for coming.